Hello everyone, Mavuika, the Pyro Archon, is finally releasing in Genshin patch 5.3. As an Archon, the vast majority of people have high standards for Mavuika's kit, expecting her to be very powerful and be impactful in the meta like the Archons before her. And despite some community concerns and criticisms during her beta, which will likely still exist after her release, Mavuika is looking to meet these Archon expectations as an extremely strong DPS and support. With such an important and unique character coming out, I wanted to sum up all the updated information you need to know about Mavuika into one final guide. I will be explaining how Mavuika works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations, while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC. As this time around, I will be showcasing calcs from multiple theory crafters that demonstrate Mavuika's strength. Mavuika is a 5-star Pyro Claymore user that ascends with crit damage. Notably, Mavuika is going to have the highest base attack in the game with 359. As the Archon of Natlan, her kit heavily plays around the Night Soul mechanic and synergizes well with other Natlan units. Mavuika has two main roles. She can be played as either an off-field support doing damage, providing buffs, and applying pyro, or as an on-field pyro main DPS that deals a lot of damage. And in both cases, Mavuika is looking to perform very well. Mavuika's two forms are outlined in her elemental skill, which has a 15-second cooldown and can be activated either by pressing or holding the skill. In both cases, when the skill is activated, Mavuika deals damage, generates 5 particles, and enters Night Soul's Blessing with 80 Night Soul points, which will slowly be consumed during the duration of her skill. If you press the skill to activate it, Mavuika spawns a ring that follows the active character. This ring will target a nearby enemy and hit all enemies within a range every 2 seconds, so it has a relatively big AoE. These hits don't have any elemental ICD, so she applies off-field pyro every 2 seconds. At C0, this turret lasts up to 12 seconds, hitting a total of 6 times. This serves as Mavuika's off-field pyro damage and application. If you hold Mavuika's skill to use it instead, however, she hops on her motorcycle. Exploration wise, while on her motorcycle, not only can Mavuika drive on land, but she can drive on water, up walls, and even fly like Molani, Shiloden, and Chaska. Combat wise, while on her motorcycle, Mavuika's normal, charged, and plunging attacks are enhanced. Even a dash will deal damage during this state. This serves as Mavuika's main DPS playstyle. While in either form, you can press skill again to swap between the two, or if you swap to another character while Mavuika is in her on-field motorcycle form, it will automatically swap to her off-field form. Next, Mavuika's elemental burst, which is a very important part of her kit. It has an 18-second cooldown, but for the first time in Genshin, the burst isn't charged via normal energy. Instead, just like how Acheron and Fei Xiao charge their ultimates differently in Honkai Star Rail, Mavuika charges her elemental burst with a unique resource called Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit can be obtained in 2 ways. First, whenever Night Soul points are consumed by any party member, they get converted into Fighting Spirit in a 1-to-1 ratio. Second, every normal attack from the party that hits an enemy gives 1.5 Fighting Spirit. Mavuika needs a minimum of 100 Fighting Spirit to use her burst, but she can hold up to 200. The more Fighting Spirit Mavuika has, the stronger the burst. Once the burst is used, Mavuika consumes all of her Fighting Spirit, gains 10 Night Soul points, deals a huge nuke of AoE damage, which increases based on the amount of Fighting Spirit consumed, and she gets on her motorcycle, entering Crucible of Life and Death for 7 seconds. This is a special state that gives Mavuika resistance to interruption, enhances the damage of all her on-field motorcycle attacks based on the amount of Fighting Spirit that was consumed, and pauses Mavuika's Night Soul consumption, allowing her on-field motorcycle attacks to not consume any Night Soul points for 7 seconds. In addition, with her A4 passive, using Mavuika's burst will give a decaying damage bonus buff for 20 seconds to the active character, depending on how much Fighting Spirit was consumed when using her burst. At max Fighting Spirit, this is a 40% damage bonus to the active character that slowly decays. Because Mavuika's burst does a huge nuke of damage, enhances her on-field damage, and gives a damage buff with her A4 passive, it is very important to have enough Fighting Spirit to not only use the burst, but to also use it with as much stacks as possible to gain its maximum damage buffs. With the max of 200 Fighting Spirit, Mavuika's burst reaches a near 1400 motion value, each of her normal and charged attacks gain about 100 and 200 motion value respectively, and the on-field character gains a decaying 40% damage bonus buff. Thus, getting a lot of Fighting Spirit stacks before using Mavuika's burst will be very important, and the best way to do so is through the consumption of Night Soul points. So, Mavuika really likes being played with other Natlan characters. For Mavuika's remaining passive talents, her A1 gives her 30% attack for 10 seconds whenever Night Soul burst is triggered, and lastly, her exploration passives are the typical Night Soul transmission stuff, on top of reducing the cooldown of Night Soul transmission by 20%. That's everything on Mavuika's base kit. In terms of talent leveling priority, for both off-field support and on-field DPS Mavuika, you'll want to level both the skill and burst eventually, but prioritize leveling her burst first. This is because not only does the burst buff the multipliers of her on-field motorcycle attacks, but also the burst's nuke of damage makes up a large part of Mavuika's damage profile for both of her playstyles, especially when reacted. As for how to properly play Mavuika, her specific rotations can vary depending on the team. This is because setting up the proper reactions for Mavuika is important whether as a main DPS or support. There will be some optimized rotations shown in the team section, but for a simplified general gameplay rotation, there are two main ones. First is setting up your support skills, then switching to Mavuika, bursting, pressing skill to max out her nitso points and switch to her off-field form, then swapping to your main DPS. Off-field support Mavuika will generally use this rotation. The second rotation version is starting with Mavuika's skill first, then setting up your support skills, then swapping back to Mavuika to use her burst and perform her on-field motorcycle attacks. You can spam normal attacks, especially if you're using supports like Yelan, but her best combo on paper is 8 charged attacks with her final slash. If she still has time remaining in her motorcycle form, you can fit in some normal attacks before it ends, where you can then loop back to the beginning of your rotation. Main DPS Mavuika will generally use this rotation. However, in some cases, you can use this rotation for a support Mavuika. In this scenario, you wouldn't on-field Mavuika after using her burst, but swap to your main DPS instead. Next, let's cover Mavuika's Constellations. C1 increases Mavuika's maximum nitso points to 120, allows Fighting Spirit to be generated more quickly, and gives her 40% attack for 8 seconds after gaining Fighting Spirit. The attack buff is nice, and the increased Fighting Spirit generation is especially impactful for teams that don't normally generate the near max 200 Fighting Spirit. In addition, increasing Mavuika's maximum nitso points increases the amount of time she can on-field, as well as increasing her potential off-field pyro uptime from 12 seconds at Z0 to 18 seconds with C1. With Mavuika's skill having a 15-second cooldown, C1 gives her off-field pyro application full uptime. However, this isn't necessarily a good thing. For instance, imagine a team with Wriothesley, Mavuika, and Xilonen. You can easily get a cryo crystallize with Xilonen on the first rotation to buff Wriothesley with 4P scroll, then use Mavuika's skill to enable melts for Wriothesley. However, if Mavuika's off-field pyro was permanently going and continuing to the next rotation, it would be impossible for Xilonen to proc another cryo crystallize to reactivate 4P scroll for Wriothesley. Thus, Mavuika's skill not having full uptime at C0 is actually a good thing because it allows proper buff setup and uptime for rotations past the first. As a result, there are some cases where Mavuika's C1 messes up certain setups. This isn't too much of a big deal as it can be played around, but I just wanted to mention this to emphasize that Mavuika doesn't need full uptime on her off-field pyro. With Mavuika's C2, when she's in Night Soul's Blessing, her base attack increases by 200, her off-field form decreases nearby enemies' defenses by 20%, and her normal and charged on-field motorcycle attacks and her burst casts deal more damage. An extremely strong constellation that gives her a lot of damage. C3 increases her burst talent level by 3, C4 gives her A4 damage bonus buff to the active character an additional 10% and makes it no longer decay over time. So with C4, her A4 damage buff is a flat 50%. C5 increases her skill talent level by 3, and lastly C6 gives both her off-field and on-field forms additional hits of damage, as well as making Mavuika's 20% death shred work on her own on-field damage. Keep in mind that these extra hits don't give Mavuika additional pyro application. Additionally, with C6, her exploration movement gets both enhanced and an increased duration. Overall, C2 is the main attraction for people who want to invest more into Mavuika. Here is a constellation comparison done by theory crafter hyperwebster for both Mavuika using Serpent Spine and her signature weapon. As you can see, in terms of early constellations, C2 will provide the biggest damage gain. C1 is a decent damage boost, but it could be more or less depending on the team, so if you aren't planning on getting C2, in my opinion, you would be better off using those pulls for her signature weapon instead. Speaking of her signature, here are the best builds for Mavuika. Weapon choices are generally the same for both on-field and off-field playstyles. Mavuika's signature is her clear best in slot that gives her a ton of damage stats. It has very high base attack, crit rate substat, and the TLDR of the special passive is that it gives Mavuika 35% crit damage and 49% attack after she uses her elemental skill or burst. Other 5-star weapons you can use as stat sticks include Beacon, Kenichi's Signature, Verdict, and Wolf's Gravestone. For 4-star weapons, as always for Claymore DPSs, Serpent Spine is the best choice assuming you can maintain full stacks. Otherwise, the other Battle Pass Claymore, Talking Stick, is a good option, as well as Akuamaru for its burst damage buff. For free-to-play options, the Fontaine craftable Tidal Shadow is a good option assuming she gets healed. Typically, Mavuika teams will have a healer. Another good option is the Melusine Claymore. Despite it having a useless ER main stat, it's still pretty good because of the attack percent that the passive gives. Mailed Flower is another free-to-play weapon that performs similarly. Now you may see other content creators say that this will be her clear best free-to-play weapon for reaction teams, as on paper, this weapon seems really good because it has an EM substat and gives additional attack and EM after Mawika's elemental skill hits an enemy or she triggers a reaction. The problem with Mailed Flower is that 1, it doesn't proc while Mawika is off field, and 2, in almost all of Mawika's main DPS rotations, she uses her skill first, then the support set up their skills, then Mawika uses her burst. By this time, Mailed Flower's passive is no longer active, so it doesn't buff Mawika's nuke of damage from her burst. But while Mailed Flower isn't her clear best free-to-play option, it's still really good. Lastly, if you don't have anything else, you could use the natlan craftable claymore. However, because the majority of Mawika's damage is not elemental skill damage, this weapon's special passive is not that good, so I would recommend using another weapon. I didn't mention every single weapon you can use, only the ones I thought were notable, so here is a complete weapon comparison made by hyperwebster for Mawika in their best melt team. Pause if you want to find the performance for a particular weapon. In terms of artifacts, for main DPS Mawika, you can use Marichusi Hunter if you're playing Mawika with Farina, but her best general set you should use is Obsidian Codex. One flaw that Obsidian Codex has is that its 4-piece set requires Night Soul point consumption, but Mawika's on-field motorcycle attacks after using her burst don't consume Night Soul points for 7 seconds. Fortunately, as long as you have Mawika's skill active for her off-field damage before swapping into her, bursting and on-fielding her, most of her attacks will still be buffed by the 4-piece set. For off-field support Mawika, 4-piece scroll is an obvious good choice. She doesn't benefit from the 2-piece, but the 4-piece team damage buff is always strong. There will be cases, however, where Mawika is in a team where another character can utilize 4-piece scroll better than her. In these scenarios, the best artifact choice for off-field Mawika will just be 4-piece Obsidian Codex. One major way that Mawika supports a team is providing a large amount of damage from her burst, so buffing the damage with 4-piece Codex will be the best option if you have another scroll user on the team. Based on an artifact comparison done by hyperwebster, it is clear that Obsidian Codex is her best set for damage. Do keep in mind that for off-field support Mawika, if you need a 4-piece scroll user on the team, it will be Mawika's best set. For artifact stats, go for EM or Attack Hourglass, Pyro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. EM Hourglass will be better for reaction teams like Vapor Melt because Mawika has little sources of EM. Attack Hourglass is still good, especially in non-reaction teams, so just choose the one you have better substats for. In terms of substat priority, look for Crit, then EM for reaction teams, then attack percent. Remember that Mawika uses Fighting Spirit instead of normal energy to charge her burst, so energy recharge is a completely useless stat on her. Finally, let's go over Mawika's best team comps. First, main DPS Mawika teams. Because Mawika's burst initial hit has such a high multiplier, she performs especially well in reaction-based teams like Vape and Melt that can multiply her damage. And since her burst is a significant portion of her damage and buffs her on-field attacks, Mawika's teams need to generate Fighting Spirit, and the most efficient way to do so is through Night Soul point consumption. Mawika herself can produce up to 90 Fighting Spirit a rotation, as her skill gives 80 Night Soul points assuming she's at 0, and her burst gives 10. But to maximize her burst damage and buffs, you'll want to pair Mawika with natlan teammates to help generate more Fighting Spirit. And there are 2 natlan characters who are Mawika's best teammates by far. The first is Sitlali. Not only does she provide off-field cryo to allow Mawika to melt her attacks, but she also buffs her damage with her Pyro Res Shred, TTDS, and is the best 4-piece scroll holder for her, along with providing a small shield. Although Sitlali alone is theoretically able to allow Mawika to melt her burst and 4 of her charged attacks, the timing for this to happen is ping dependent, precise, and unrealistic, so in general, solo Sitlali will only allow Mawika to melt her burst and 2 of her charged attacks. But despite this, Sitlali is one of Mawika's best teammates and will be a must if you want to play Mawika's strong melt teams. The second natlan teammate that synergizes well with Mawika is Xiangling. I think everyone already knows how good Xiangling is with her Res Shred and healing. She's also a 4-piece scroll holder, but if someone like Sitlali is on the team who holds scroll better, Xiangling can use Arcade Petra to bring more buffs. However, one of the biggest benefits of Xiangling is her Night Soul point generation. Most natlan characters require an entire rotation to occur in order to consume their Night Soul points. With Xiangling's kit, however, she instantly generates and consumes 90 Night Soul points instantly when she presses skill and 2 normal attacks to activate her Res Shred. If you use her burst in between, she consumes close to 100. This front loading of Fighting Spirit generation makes it very easy to charge Mawika's burst, and combined with her Res Shred, Xiangling is the best general natlan teammate for Mawika that works in a lot of teams. You don't need both Sitlali and Xiangling for Mawika to be an amazing DPS. Generally, to access her best teams, you will just need one or the other. Mawika's best team on paper though does run both Sitlali and Xiangling alongside Bennett for his attack buff. This melt team is literally just putting some of the best buffers in the game for Mawika, and the result is the new highest damaging team on paper. Now if you don't want to use Bennett with the Sitlali Xilonen core, you can replace him with an animo support like Sucrose or a second cryo offfielder like Rosaria or Kaya. Because Mavuika has little sources of EM, Sucrose is generally better than Kazuha, though Kazuha can still be used. Running double cryo does make Mavuika melting 4 charged attacks more achievable. However, you do lose out on buffs and have to deal with other issues such as Rosaria's circle or Kaya's low range. If you don't have Xilonen but are planning to have Sitlali, you can replace Xilonen with the animo support or second cryo slot and you'll still have a strong melt team enabled by Sitlali. Now if you have Xilonen but don't plan on pulling Sitlali, her melt teams won't be as good. Sitlali's best replacement however is Farina. Paired with Xilonen and Bennett, this is Mavuika's best vape team on paper. Running double Hydro instead of Bennett is also an option. Just remember to spam normal attacks on Mavuika and not her charged attacks when using a support like Yelan. Mavuika can even work decently in a non-reaction team like Mono Pyro by brute forcing with raw damage, though these teams will generally be worse than reaction-based teams. Now the biggest concern for Mavuika's main DPS teams is if you don't have Xilonen or Sitlali. The reality is that if you don't have either of these characters, you cannot access most of Mavuika's best teams and her team building will be much more limited. However, she does have some options. You could just force a plunge vape team with Shenyun and Farina and bursting every other rotation with Mavuika. However, the best looking option on paper is a Chevreuse Overload team with Auroron. Because Mavuika deals Night Soul aligned damage, she can activate Auroron's off-field damage herself without needing Electrocharge. Though Auroron doesn't consume as much Night Soul points as Sitlali or Xilonen, you still get a good amount of fighting spirit with him and Mavuika. And with Auroron being the only Electro character on the team, he has Soul Overload ownership, making full EM Auroron potentially better than his normal crit build. Now other than that, your only other options are using Kachina instead of Xilonen or Pyro MC instead of Bennett, as they both are free. Obviously, if you have to do this, Mavuika's teams will drop in performance compared to her better options. But since Mavuika's numbers are so high since she's a newly released character, even with her less optimal teams, she should still be enough to clear Abyss. To wrap this up, here are some extensive Mavuika main DPS team calculations done by hyperwebster. Most of the teams I highlighted are calced here, along with detailing the specific builds, rotations, and assumptions used. Huge thanks to hyperwebster for doing all of this great work and allowing me to showcase his calcs here. There is a lot of detailed info, so definitely feel free to pause to take a closer look. He also added some personal notes on these teams on the bottom, and one thing he said which I want to highlight is that the amount of fighting spirit a team can generate can differ in practice, especially for non-Xilonen teams. You may end in Abyss Chamber early with fewer fighting spirit and have to spend extra time generating more stacks for your next rotation, or you may extend your original rotation, allowing for more fighting spirit on your next rotation. Thus, in practice, teams may perform better or worse than on paper. Next, off-field support Mavuika teams. Mavuika still likes having other natlan characters like Sitlali and Xilonen since her burst is still important as a support. However, the main point of contention is using Mavuika or Xiangling as your off-field pyro applicator. Mavuika applies AoE pyro off-field every 2 seconds. This is not as much pyro as what Xiangling can provide with Pyro NATO. However, this doesn't make Mavuika bad as a support. In many teams that need off-field pyro application, they don't actually need that much, and thus Mavuika's pyro application is perfectly fine. So in these teams, Mavuika is a Xiangling alternative or upgrade because she deals similar or more damage, especially if you can react her burst, has a buff to the active character with her A4 passive, can provide even more buffs with 4P scroll if she uses it, and can play with shorter rotation times compared to the forced 20-second rotation of Pyro NATO. On top of that, Mavuika brings huge quality of life because her off-field pyro just comes from the top of her skill, so you don't have to worry about batterying a 300 ER Xiangling. A lot of good DPSs are looking to get sizable buffs with the release of Mavuika. First, Knight teams are getting buffed, as along with the release of Pyro Traveler, Knight teams are finally getting a holder of 4P scroll. Mavuika will be better than Pyro Traveler in a burning team since she does more damage and provides more buffs, but both are still good. With burning teams, Mavuika can't reactivate 4P scroll on second rotation onwards since she can't trigger another reaction, but even with this uptime problem, assuming no multi-wave or boss phasing, scroll is still good. Also, using Mavuika's long animation burst can steal Bennett uptime from Knight, but this isn't really a problem since Mavuika's burst deals good damage. For non-Emily havers, you can use Farina instead, but Knight will lose potential skill cast. Two surprisingly better options is using either Sitlali or Auroron. These teams can maintain more burning uptime for more Knight skills, and for teams using Sitlali, you can perform a rotation where Mavuika can melt her burst for a large source of nuke damage. hyperwebster has also calced various Knight teams with Mavuika along with current Knight teams without her, so again, big thanks to him for allowing me to showcase his calcs. Big takeaway here is that Mavuika is generally just a strict upgrade for Knight over his current best teams. Chaska teams are also looking to get buffed with Mavuika. If we build off of of Chaska's current best C0 team, Mavuika will be an upgrade over Oberon as a scroll user, as she brings more personal damage and allows Mavuika to focus purely on vapes. You generally won't be replacing Bennett with Mavuika, so not all of Chaska's teammates will be different elements, resulting in her charged attacks receiving less damage bonus and losing a bullet from her A1 passive. Despite this, it's still an upgrade in damage. For a similar reason, using Citlali over Farina makes the team even better, allowing Chaska to focus on melts and allowing Mavuika to melt her burst as well. Here are some extensive Chaska team calcs with builds, rotations, and assumptions made by Sensi, another theory crafter who has done a lot of good work on Chaska ever since her beta, so huge thanks to him for allowing me to showcase his calcs. Included are C0 Chaska calcs, C0 calcs with an optimized 5 charge attack Chaska rotation, and calcs with C1 Chaska. Feel free to pause to take a closer look. Big takeaway here is that again, Mavuika looks to be a strict upgrade from current Chaska teams. Next, Molani teams are getting a buff with one caveat. In teams where Molani is paired with another Hydro support that applies a lot of Hydro like Farina, Yelan, or C6 Candace, Mavuika's Pyro application is not enough for Molani and you'll have to use Xiangling. However, these are not the only Molani teams out there, and in those teams, Mavuika buffs Molani with more team damage and with better quality of life Pyro application. Also, Molani's front-loaded nature appreciates Mavuika's front-loaded A4 buff, and Mavuika having another source of nuke damage is a plus as well. As I go over the best Molani Mavuika teams, I will showcase calcs done by theory crafter vomfee, who has done extensive and detailed calcs on Molani since her beta, so big thanks to him for allowing me to showcase his calcs. Double Hydro Molani teams are still possible with a Hydro teammate like C5 and below Candace that doesn't apply that much Hydro to ensure that Mavuika's Pyro application is reserved for Molani vapes. Similarly, Mona also works as a solid Molani buffer because she doesn't apply that much Hydro, allowing Mavuika to still function for Molani. Moving away from double Hydro, you can use an animal support like Sucrose instead. Although her buffs don't last long enough to buff all of Molani's attacks, some of them do still get buffed, and buffs are buffs nevertheless. For both a safe and solid option for damage, you can run Xiangling for a double Geo support comp. Xiangling's res shred from his shield is helpful, he can hold 4-piece Petra, and most importantly, the shield will make playing Molani very comfortable. Lastly, for a theoretical high damage Molani team on paper, you can consider using Citlali. Now this team is quite complex because it requires Citlali to not be completely leveled and ignores activating her off-field cryo application. This is to ensure that Mavuika melts her burst and that there isn't any cryo left to mess up Molani vaping from Mavuika's Pyro application, allowing Citlali to buff both Molani's and Mavuika's damage. Because this team is a bit unintuitive and precise, I wouldn't recommend this team for general play, but for those looking to really optimize, consider trying it out. Natlan DPSs aren't the only ones getting buffed by Mavuika. Navia double Pyro with Xilonin will be better with Mavuika over Xiangling, as Mavuika provides an additional buff from her A4 and more personal damage. In fact, it's likely better to play this team as a dual carry comp instead, focusing on on-fielding Mavuika and swapping every so often for Navia skill nukes. Cloran also works well with Mavuika in Chevrolet's overload teams. With Mavuika's presence, Auroran's kit works without electrocharge and can be the 4-piece scroll user, allowing Mavuika to run Codex for her personal damage. And Cloran herself can help generate fighting spirit for Mavuika because she deals normal tank damage. Wriothesley is also looking to benefit from Mavuika. You can't play Wriothesley with Mavuika in Vape Melt, but she works in normal melt teams with Xilonin or Citlali, or burn melt teams with Emily. Ganyu, however, is a bit different. Because her aim shots can be shot faster than 2 seconds, you kinda need burn melt for Mavuika to work. But the biggest problem is that if you run Mavuika, you're likely not running a shield without losing an important buffer. You can still make it work though. If you play mono pyro teams with DPSs like Arlecchino and Linny, Mavuika should be a slight upgrade over Xiangling with her extra A4 buff and personal damage. There are plenty of other DPSs I haven't mentioned that can make Mavuika work as a support in their teams. Units like Nebulet and Hu Tao can just insert Mavuika into their team and they should function fine. Mavuika may not necessarily be the best option for these units, but she will work nevertheless. However, the two characters that I want to highlight where you shouldn't play Mavuika over someone like Xiangling are Child and Raiden. Child really wants Xiangling so that his Hydro application can drive Pyronado vapes, and Raiden's kit is anti-synergistic with Mavuika's. Mavuika doesn't use energy, so Raiden's energy refund from her burst doesn't work for her, and because Mavuika's burst doesn't have an energy cost, she gives no resolve stacks for Raiden. To conclude this Mavuika guide, I wanted to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. As the Pyro Archon, it is fitting that Mavuika is looking like a really strong character, being both a top meta Pyro main DPS and a top meta Pyro off-field support. The main playstyle that I think most people will focus on is Mavuika as a main DPS, since that's where you'll get all the big numbers. With Mavuika's best main DPS team alongside Citlali, Xilonin, and Bennett, on paper, this is the highest damaging team in the game. The best teams from current top DPSs like Nebulet and Arlecchino Arlecchino are under Mavuika's top team, assuming equal investment. And even if you don't have both Sitlali and Xiangling, as long as you have one of them, you can make a very strong Mavuika team that is among the best teams in the game. Now of course, damage numbers aren't everything. Mavuika is more reliant on specific teammates as she depends on activating her burst and triggering reactions like Vape and Melt to reach her high damage numbers. In contrast, both Neuvillette and Arlecchino aren't burst reliant and don't necessarily need to be played in reaction based teams, allowing their rotations to be more flexible in multi-wave scenarios. And while both Neuvillette and Arlecchino are also reliant on specific teammates, as Neuvillette without Farina and Arlecchino without Bennett will deal significantly less damage, they aren't as reliant on them and will perform better on their own. And of course, in the case of Neuvillette, the main reason he's currently considered the best DPS is that he's easy to play, has self-healing, and his attacks have large AoE. But Mavuika does have her share of quality of life. Her burst gives her on-fielding 100% resistance to interruption for 7 seconds, her motorcycle charged attacks have a large AoE, and unlike Arlecchino, she can get healed by 2 healers in her best teams. On top of that, Mavuika is arguably the easiest DPS to play out of all 3, as after you set up your supports and swap to Mavuika to burst and on-field, all you have to do is hold down the attack button once to perform her motorcycle charged attacks. So with her quality of life and her high damage numbers in her best teams, I can easily see the argument for Mavuika being the new best DPS in the game. But regardless on how you view the top DPS comparisons, it is undeniable based on the numbers that Mavuika will be joining Neuvillette and Arlecchino as one of the best carries in the game. Since Mavuika is another Pyro on-fielder, the best comparison for this role is with Arlecchino. Both are very strong carries in all types of Pyro teams such as Vape, Melt, Monopyro, and Shepherd's Overload. The main distinctions between the two at equal investment is that Mavuika will generally perform better in reaction-based teams like Vape and Melt, while Arlecchino will perform better in non-reaction teams like Shepherd's Overload and Monopyro. Mavuika is more burst and team reliant, while Arlecchino works better in multi-wave and solo scenarios. However, the damage difference between the two carries isn't that massive. Arlecchino is still very strong in Vape and Melt, and Mavuika is still very strong in Shepherd's Overload and Monopyro. However, Mavuika has much better quality of life in combat with resistance to interruption, large AoE charge attacks, and the ability to actually get healed in combat. Thus, at equal investment, I do think Mavuika is the overall better DPS. However, when you start considering factors like not having Sitlali or Xiangling, or having Arlecchino's signature in Constellations while not getting Mavuika's, then Arlecchino will be better. Ultimately, if you already have a pretty invested Arlecchino and are just interested in Mavuika's main DPS potential, Mavuika isn't that valuable of a pull. Arlecchino can do the job just fine. However, Mavuika's kit isn't designed for her to just be another Pyro main DPS. She's also an extremely strong off-field support as well, and I do think people are underestimating Mavuika's strength as a support just due to the fact that her off-field AoE Pyro application is lower than Xiangling's. And although this is true, the reality is that aside from teams like Vape Melt, some Rev Melt setups, and Double Hydro Vape, most teams don't need Xiangling's Pyro application to function. Mavuika's AoE Pyro application is perfectly fine for a lot of teams, and in these teams, Mavuika serves as a Xiangling alternative or just a strict upgrade. Mavuika provides more team buffs from her A4 passive, and 4-piece scroll, if you use it on her, can provide as much or even more personal damage with the burst, especially if you react it, and her off-field Pyro application isn't locked behind a 20-second cooldown like Xiangling's, allowing you to play shorter rotations. And most importantly, Mavuika's off-field Pyro application provides much better quality of life for teams as it just comes from her press skill, so you don't have to worry about having enough energy on Xiangling for her burst. So many teams are looking to get buffed by Mavuika's supportive capabilities, including Knight, Chaska, Molani, Navia, Cloran, and Risley, and there are many more that will work with Mavuika. All of these strengths do come with a cost. In Mavuika's best teams, she needs to be paired with another natlan character to generate enough fighting spirit for her burst. Sitlali and Xiangling specifically are her best teammates, and ideally you have at least one of them to pair with Mavuika. Xiangling especially for more general teams, while Sitlali is specifically for Melt. If you don't have either, your team building options are much more limited and you will notice a difference in her performance. And while this is a hefty downside in terms of her flexibility, I think it's a worthy price to pay to access Mavuika's power. Mavuika is an Archon that needs to be played around, similar to how you need to have a healer to maximize Farina's fanfare buff, but to a larger extent. And if you're able to meet these team building restrictions, you will be greatly rewarded. If I were to compare the Archons between each other and rank them based on strength and pull value, to me, Farina is still the best Archon. She does damage, provides a large buff, her healer restriction is easily met, and being Hydro just makes her a very general support. Mavuika, however, easily makes the tier below her alongside Nahida and Zhongli to me. Now these three's placements are easily interchangeable depending on how much you value a particular Archon strength. You might really value Nahida's power in Dendro teams like Hyperbloom that are strong, or you may really value the comfort that Zhongli provides to any team with his shield. You can rank all three of these Archons second, third, and fourth and make a solid case for any any rank. But because Mavuika's best teams deal top tier damage, she has a ton of quality of life as an on-fielder like large AoE attacks and resistance to interruption, on top of being a strong off-field support, buffing many teams and giving a quality of life upgrade over Xiangling. For these reasons, I do think Mavuika is arguably the second best Archon in the game. In many ways, Mavuika is the modern version of Raiden. Both are Archons with main DPS forms that a team builds around, and both have off-field support capabilities. What makes Mavuika modern is that she just has higher numbers in terms of damage and buffs, and her off-field Pyro application is much more useful than Raiden's off-field Electro application. And to me, this is where Mavuika's pull value lies. You're not just getting another Pyro main DPS with higher numbers, you're pulling for a very strong Pyro main DPS that can also be played as a really strong support, which to me increases her value a lot. Mavuika is a very strong main DPS and support with an extremely high damage ceiling if you have the right pieces to build around her. But even if you don't have her best teammates like Sitlali or Xilonen, whether because you skip them or because you are a newer player, you can still make Mavuika work. For main DPS Mavuika, there are 4-star natlan support options like Aurora and Gachina. There are also teams with no natlan supports and you just burst every other rotation, and because Mavuika just has higher numbers at base since she's a newer character, even the more suboptimal teams should be enough for Abyss. And for support Mavuika, you can just use your skill in any team regardless and benefit from its quality of life over Xiangling's burst. I wouldn't call Mavuika a must pull as she does have her flaws like team building restrictions, and I don't think anyone needs to pull for any specific character, but with Mavuika's high damage capabilities as a main DPS and ability to buff many other carries as an off-field support, I think Mavuika will be a great pull for many accounts, whether new or veteran ones. And that's everything I wanted to cover about Mavuika. Because Mavuika is such an important and impactful character as the Pyro Archon, I wanted to make this guide the most comprehensive and detailed guide on the channel yet, and I couldn't have done it without the theory crafters behind the math I showcased in this video. So again, big thanks to hyperwebster, Sensi, and vomfee for granting me permission to showcase their calcs. All of them do great TC work. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Mavuika. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel out immensely, and if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or feel free to click the subscribe button for more pre-release analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Mavuika pulls.